Hey, my name is Henry, and I hike alone because my own house is too quiet. For 3 years, I packed my bag every weekend and walked into the woods where the silence felt like something I chose instead of something I was stuck with. Then, one evening in late October, a storm I didn't see coming tore my tent apart and left me sitting in the rain with nothing. And a woman I had never met opened her tent and told me to come inside. I didn't know it then, but that single night would change the way I understood what it means to stop being alone. I'm 34, and I build things for a living. Cabinets, tables, bookshelves, the kind of work that keeps your hands busy and your mind somewhere else, which is the only way I've found to get through a day without thinking too much. I have a small shop just outside of town, and most days I'm there from 7 in the morning until the light starts to go. The sawdust gets into everything: my clothes, my truck, the creases of my knuckles. Wood is honest material that shows when you cut it wrong and shines when you sand it right. There's no pretending with a piece of oak, and some days that's the only thing I trust. I live alone in a 2-bedroom house at the end of a dirt road. It's not much, but it's mine, and for 3 years it's been quiet in a way that fills up every room like water filling a glass. My wife, Anna, died in the spring of 3 years ago from cancer, fast and brutal, and nothing like the way they show it in movies, where people get to say beautiful things at the end and hold hands and mean them. She was 31, and so was I. We'd been married 4 years, and we were just starting to figure out the shape of our life together when it stopped. After the funeral, I went back to work the next week because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I built a dining table for a client whose face I can't remember. I sanded the edges until my fingers were raw. And I kept going like that, day after day, because stopping meant sitting in a house where her coffee mug was still on the counter and her boots were still by the door. The hiking started about 6 months after she died. A guy I know from the lumber yard, Cal, told me I should get outside on weekends instead of spending them in the shop. He meant well. I went once and hated every minute of it. The sweating, the bugs, the way my legs burned on the first hill. Then I went again the next weekend because the thing I hated was that it made me feel something, and feeling something turned out to be better than the flat nothing I'd been carrying. I walked a simple trail near my house, a 4-mile loop with a creek crossing and one good hill. By the time I got back to my truck, my legs ached and my chest felt lighter. I didn't understand why, but I just knew I wanted to do it again. Over the next 2 years, the trails got longer and the weekends got fuller. I bought better boots, a lighter pack, a 3-season tent that the guy at the gear store swore could handle anything. I started driving farther from home, picking routes that fewer people used, where I could walk for hours without seeing another face. The silence in the woods was different from the silence in my house. Out there, the quiet had a reason. The trees didn't know my name, and the wind didn't remind me of anything. I could walk for hours, and the only voice in my head was the one telling me to put one foot in front of the other. This trail was the hardest one I'd picked yet. A late-season route through the Cascade foothills, 12 miles in and 12 miles out, with a ridge crossing that went above the tree line and exposure that could get ugly if the weather turned. The forecast said partly cloudy, highs in the 50s, light wind. I checked it 3 times the night before because checking things is how I keep the world manageable. I laid my gear out on the living room floor the way I always do, checking each piece against my list. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, extra layers, first aid, headlamp, map. I packed the bag and set it by the door. Then I stood in the kitchen for a long minute, looking at the mug I still keep on the counter. And I turned off the light and went to bed. I drove to the trailhead in the dark, the way I always do. I like starting before sunrise because you get the woods to yourself, and the first light coming through the trees is something I never get tired of, even on the days when I'm tired of everything else. The first 3 hours were good. The trail was well marked, the grade was steady, and the air had that sharp, clean bite that late October gets when the first real cold is coming. I moved fast, the way I like to, letting my legs find a rhythm and my mind go quiet. The trees were mostly fir and hemlock, tall and dark, with the kind of canopy that blocks the sky so you forget to look up. I should have looked up. Around noon, I stopped to eat a sandwich and refill my water from a creek that ran across the trail. The light had changed. I hadn't noticed it happening, but the sky had gone from pale blue to a flat, heavy gray that sat low over the trees like a lid pressing down. The temperature had dropped too, enough that I pulled on my fleece without thinking about it. The wind, which had been nothing all morning, had picked up enough to move the branches in a way that sounded like breathing. I checked my phone. The screen showed no signal, which wasn't unusual this far in. The weather app still displayed the forecast from the night before: partly cloudy, light wind, the same words I'd read 3 times. I looked at the sky and then at the phone and decided the sky was wrong. That was the first bad call. The second one was not turning around. I told myself I could make the ridge by mid-afternoon and be on the other side before anything got serious. I told myself that I'd hiked in worse conditions, which was true, but those conditions had never been this far from a road. The truth was that turning around meant giving up on the trail I'd planned, and I'd rather push through discomfort than sit with the feeling of something not going my way. That pattern had cost me before, in ways that had nothing to do with hiking. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind was strong enough that I had to lean into it on the open stretches. The trees were swaying, and the sound they made was a low, grinding groan that I could feel in my chest. The temperature had dropped into the 30s, and the clouds had thickened to the point where the light was flat and directionless, like dusk coming 4 hours early. I stopped on the ridge and looked west. The clouds were moving fast, dark and stacked, and there was a wall of something coming that looked like it meant business. The kind of darkness that doesn't come from the sun going down, but from the sky itself closing over you. I made the call to set up camp early. There was a partial shelter about a half-mile ahead, a spot where the trail dipped into a small hollow with some tree cover. I'd seen it on the map and marked it with a pencil. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being exposed on the ridge when whatever was coming finally hit. I moved fast. The first drops started falling before I got the tent out of the pack, cold and heavy, the kind that soak through a fleece in seconds. I got the tent up in 10 minutes, my hands moving on their own, the same motions I'd done 100 times in calmer conditions. I crawled inside, pulled the fly tight, and for a moment, sitting on my sleeping bag with the rain starting to drum on the nylon, I thought I'd beaten it. The rain got louder, the wind picked up, and then it got worse. It wasn't rain anymore. It was a wall of water and wind that hit the tent like something with hands, shaking the whole structure, pushing the walls inward, finding every gap and seam. The nylon snapped and popped, and the poles flexed in ways they weren't designed to flex. I could feel the tent shifting under me, the floor sliding on the ground cloth, the walls bowing with each gust like the storm was trying to fold the tent in half. I braced my back against the main pole and held it. The aluminum was cold even through my shirt, and I could feel it bending, a slow, sickening flex that told me the engineering of this tent had not been built for what was happening outside it. The rain was coming sideways now, finding the seams, coming through the ventilation flaps in thin sheets that soaked my sleeping bag and pooled in the corners. The first big gust came without warning. It hit the side of the tent like a truck, and one corner of the fly ripped free from its stake with a sound like a gunshot. The tent lurched, and I grabbed for the pole with both hands, but the angle had changed and the force was all wrong. The aluminum snapped with a sound like a dry branch breaking, a clean, sharp crack that I felt in my chest before I heard it. The tent collapsed around me. I was inside a pile of wet nylon and broken poles, the rain coming in horizontally through the torn fabric, the wind howling through the space that used to be my shelter. I fought my way out through the door flap and got to my knees in the mud. The rain hit my face so hard I had to squint to see, and what I saw was not good. The hollow I'd camped in was filling with water. The trees were bending. The light was gone, replaced by a gray darkness that made it hard to tell where the trail was. I was soaked. Not damp, not wet, but soaked through every layer to the skin, the kind of wet that pulls the heat out of your body faster than you can make it. My hands were shaking, and not from the adrenaline. The temperature was dropping, and I was kneeling in a creek of runoff water that pulled at my boots. I tried to fix it. I pulled the broken pole out and tried to rig a support using a branch and some paracord, the way you do when something goes wrong, and you don't want to admit how wrong. My fingers were too cold to tie the knots, clumsy and thick, the cord slipping through them like water. The branch snapped, and the tent fell again, and I stood there looking at it and understood something I'd been avoiding for 3 years. There are problems you can't solve by yourself. There are moments when being alone isn't a choice you make to feel free. It's just a trap you walked into because you were too stubborn to ask for help. I crouched under the wreckage of the tent, my arms around my knees, the rain hammering the nylon above me. I was shaking hard now, the kind of shaking that comes from deep inside your core, and I knew enough about hypothermia to know I had maybe an hour before things got dangerous. I had a dry bag with extra clothes, but I couldn't get to it without exposing myself to more rain, and the rain was the problem. I sat there in the mud, in the dark, in the worst storm I'd ever been in, and I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I admitted I was in trouble. Not to anyone, because there was no one. Just to myself, in my own head, the way you admit things when there's no one left to perform for. And then, through the wind and the rain and the noise of the storm, I heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, cutting through the storm the way a light cuts through fog. I couldn't make out the words at first, just the shape of someone calling out, steady and deliberate, not panicked. I turned my head toward it and saw something I almost didn't believe. A light. A headlamp, steady and unwavering, maybe 50 yards through the trees. It wasn't moving. It was just there, like a porch light left on for someone who hadn't come home yet. And in that moment, it was the most welcome thing I'd seen in a long time. I got up. My legs were stiff and cold, and the mud tried to hold my boots, but I moved toward the light because there was nothing else to do. I pushed through a stand of young firs, branches whipping my face, and came into a small clearing I hadn't noticed on the way in. It was sheltered, tucked behind a low rock outcrop that blocked the worst of the wind, and in the middle of it, a tent was standing. Not struggling, not leaning, but standing the way a tent is supposed to stand, its guy lines taut, and its fly tight, and its poles straight. The woman was crouched at the door, her headlamp aimed at me. She was maybe my age, with blonde hair plastered to her face by the rain. She looked at me, and then at the wreckage of my tent visible through the trees, and she didn't say anything for a second. She just took in the situation, the way you take in a problem before you start solving it. I was standing in front of her, soaked to the bone, shaking so hard my teeth were clicking, mud up to my knees, holding a broken tent pole like it meant something. "You need to come inside," she said, and she said it like a statement, not a question or an offer. My pride did the thing it always does. It tried to speak up. I almost said I could manage, that I'd be fine, that I just needed to rig something and I'd be okay. But my body made the decision before my mouth could ruin it. My jaw was shaking too hard to form the words, and my hands had gone past cold, into something numb and clumsy that I didn't recognize as my own. "Stay in mine," she said. The words were simple and clear, and she said them the way you'd tell someone to take a seat, like it was the obvious thing, and there was no reason to make it complicated. I don't know where the next words came from. Something in me, some part that the cold and the fear had stripped bare, said something I would never say to a stranger under normal circumstances. "Only if you promise not to regret it." She looked at me for a second, and then she smiled. Not a polite smile, not a nervous one, but a real one, the kind that starts slow and reaches the eyes. "I don't make promises I can't keep," she said. "Get inside." I ducked through the door of her tent, and the moment I was inside, the storm changed. It was still there, still screaming outside, still hammering the fly and shaking the walls, but it sounded like something happening to someone else. The tent was dry. It was warm. There was a small camp stove glowing in the corner, and the amber light from it was the most welcome thing I'd seen since the headlamp in the trees. She came in behind me and zipped the door shut. The tent was small, a two-person, and with both of us in it, there wasn't much room to move. She settled onto her sleeping pad and reached for a dry shirt folded in the corner, then handed it to me without ceremony. "Here," she said. "It won't fit, but it's dry." I took it. I pulled off my soaked fleece and put on the shirt, which was too tight across the shoulders and too short at the wrists, and it was the best thing I'd ever worn. She was already heating water on the stove, her movements calm and practiced, like she'd done this 100 times, and a stranger in the mud was just part of the routine. "I'm Emma, by the way," she said, not looking up from the stove, "and you look like you've had a better day." "I'm Henry," I said, "and that's the most honest thing anyone's said to me all day." She laughed, short and warm, and handed me a cup of something hot. Tea, some kind of herbal blend I didn't recognize, with a faint sweetness to it that cut through the cold in my chest. I wrapped both hands around the cup and held it like it was the only warm thing left in the world. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. The storm did the talking, hammering the tent in waves, and we just sat there, in the small amber glow of the stove, and let it be. The awkwardness came after the warmth. Once my hands stopped shaking and my jaw unclenched, I became aware of the situation I was in. I was sitting in a stranger's tent, wearing her shirt, drinking her tea, close enough that if I stretched out my legs, I'd hit her sleeping pad. The tent was maybe 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, and the two of us filled it the way furniture fills a small room. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. She sat cross-legged on her pad, her own cup in her hands, and started asking me questions. Easy ones at first. Where had I started? How far was I going? What kind of tent had I been using? I gave her short answers at first, the way I do with people I don't know. Day hiker to through hiker, a ridge crossing, a 3-season tent that turned out to be more like a 2-season tent. But she kept asking, not pushy, just steady, the way someone talks when they're comfortable and they want you to be comfortable too. And somewhere between the third question and the fourth, my answers got longer. She told me about her route. She'd come in from the south side, a different trailhead, and she'd been out for 3 days already. She was planning to camp on the ridge and hike out the next morning, but the storm had changed her plan. She'd seen it coming earlier than I had, moved to the sheltered spot, and set up while there was still light. "You saw it coming," I said. "I checked the forecast 3 times and decided the sky was wrong." She smiled into her cup. "The sky's never wrong," she said. "The forecast is just a guess." I noticed things about her in the quiet stretches between questions. The way she held her cup with both hands, the same way I did, like the warmth was something worth hanging on to. A small leather journal tucked into the corner of the tent, worn at the edges, the kind of journal that gets used, not displayed. And she was alone on a mountain in late October, and she was the calmest person I'd met in years. Calm in a way that suggested she'd been through things that would have rattled most people, and had come out the other side with her hands steady. It unsettled me. Not her, but what she made me feel. I'd spent 3 years around people who looked at me like they could see the weight I was carrying and didn't want to ask about it. Emma didn't look at me like that. She looked at me like I was a guy who needed tea and a dry shirt, and that was all. And somehow that was more disarming than any amount of concern would have been. The storm kept going. The rain hit the tent in sheets, and the wind moaned through the guy lines, and the temperature outside was dropping. But inside, the stove pushed back the cold, and the tea was warm, and for the first time in a long time, I was sitting close enough to another person to hear her breathing. She pulled out the journal after a while and started writing. The scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound besides the storm, and I lay back on my sleeping pad, which she'd offered without me asking, and listened to both. The silence between us had changed. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was the kind of quiet you get when two people stop trying to fill every gap with words and just let the moment be itself. I didn't know it then, but that was the first crack. We talked more after that. I don't remember who started it or what the first real question was, only that the conversation shifted at some point from trail talk to something else, the way a creek shifts from shallow to deep without a sign. I went first, which surprised me. I don't talk about Anna, not to Cal, not to the guys at the lumber yard, not to anyone. But something about the tent, the dark, the sound of the storm outside, made it easier. Like the words had been sitting in my chest for 3 years, and the right conditions finally loosened them. I didn't tell the whole story. I just said that I'd lost my wife 3 years ago, and that I'd been hiking since then because the woods were the only place the quiet didn't feel like it was watching me. I said, a few years back, and it changed how I see things, and I left it there, the way you leave a door cracked instead of opening it all the way. Emma listened. She didn't fill the silence with the things people say when they don't know what to say, the "I'm sorry" and the "she's in a better place," and the other phrases that are meant to help but just make you feel more alone. She just sat there, her cup in her hands, and let the quiet hold what I'd said. Then she told me her story. She came out here because the world had gotten too loud. A bad year, she called it, a job that had drained her down to nothing, a relationship that ended not with a fight, but with a slow fade, the kind where you wake up one morning and realize you've been alone in the room for months, even though someone else was still in it. She said the trail gave her back a sense of scale. That out here, the things that felt enormous in a city or a kitchen or an office became small again, and the things she'd been ignoring became clear. Or it just makes the quiet portable, I said. I don't know where it came from. It just came out, the way things come out when you're sitting in a tent with someone who stopped feeling like a stranger. She looked at me, and then she laughed. A real laugh, not polite, not small, but the kind that comes from being surprised by someone. And I laughed too. The sound of it was strange to me, like hearing a song I'd forgotten I knew. I hadn't laughed around another person in a long time, and I was laughing in a tent on a mountain in a storm with a woman I'd met 2 hours ago, and I couldn't explain it and didn't try to. We sat with that for a while. The storm had become background, the way traffic becomes background when you're inside. She went back to her journal, and I lay on the pad and stared at the ceiling of the tent, where the stove light made the nylon glow like something alive. I thought about the last 3 years, and how I'd built my life around the idea that being alone was safer than being with someone, because being alone didn't come with the risk of losing again. And sitting in that tent, listening to Emma breathe and the storm rage and the pen scratch on paper, I felt something shift in my chest that I'd been holding in place for 3 years. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like a knot loosening, the way a muscle loosens when you finally stop clenching it. I didn't know what it meant yet, but the quiet in the tent felt different from the quiet in my house, and the difference had something to do with the woman sitting 3 feet away from me, writing in a journal like the world outside wasn't trying to kill both of us. Morning came gray and wet. The storm had shifted from a roar to a steady, cold rain, the kind that doesn't stop, but doesn't commit to anything either. I unzipped the tent door and looked out at a world that had turned to water. The trail was a creek, the trees were dripping, the sky was a low, flat ceiling of gray that showed no sign of breaking. "We're not hiking out today," Emma said behind me. She was already heating water for oatmeal, her movements the same calm routine as last night. "Not in this. The trail's too saturated, and the ridge will be a mess." She was right, and I knew it, and part of me was glad. The other part, the part that had been managing my life alone for 3 years, felt the strangeness of spending a full day in a tent with someone I'd met in a storm. But there was nothing to do about it, so I did what I always do when I can't control the situation. I adapted. The day took on a rhythm. She made oatmeal on the stove, and we ate it from the pot, passing a spoon back and forth because she only had one. I pulled my wet gear out of my pack and hung it from the guy lines inside the tent, trying to dry what I could. She reorganized her food bag and counted her supplies, and told me she had enough for 2 more days if we were careful. We moved around each other in the small space, negotiating the same square footage over and over, until it started to feel less like her tent and more like a place we both lived. The conversation came and went in waves. We talked about trails we'd hiked, the best meals we'd eaten on mountains, the things we missed about being around people, and the things we didn't. She told me about a trip she'd taken to the Wind River Range the year before, solo, 12 days, and how she'd come back feeling like she'd put herself back together, one piece at a time. I told her about the table I was building for a client, a walnut dining table with a live edge, and how I'd been working on it for weeks and it still didn't feel right. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. "I don't know. The wood is good, the joinery is clean. It just feels like it's missing something." She thought about that for a second, turning her cup in her hands. "Maybe it's not missing something," she said. "Maybe you just haven't let it tell you what it wants to be yet." I didn't say anything to that, but it stayed with me. The kind of thing someone says casually and doesn't know they've just said something that matters more than they intended. At one point, she caught me looking at the journal. She smiled and said, "It's not interesting, just trail notes and bad poetry." She didn't offer to show me, and I didn't ask. But the wanting to ask was something I noticed, the way you notice a sound you've been hearing for a while without realizing it was there. By late afternoon, the rain eased to a drizzle. Emma poked her head out and studied the sky the way a farmer reads weather, squinting at the clouds and the light. "It might break by evening," she said, "but we should move to a better camp before dark. There's a spot a mile north, lower elevation, more sheltered." We packed up together, and for the first time since Anna died, I moved through a task alongside someone else, and it felt natural instead of painful. We hiked north along the trail, which was soft and slick with mud, every step a small negotiation with the ground. The rain had stopped, but the world was still wet, every surface dark and gleaming, every branch heavy with water. Emma moved ahead of me, sure-footed and steady, reading the trail the way she'd read the sky, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing what she was doing and not needing to prove it. We reached a section where the trail crossed an exposed ridge. The trees fell away on both sides, and the wind hit us full force, cold and sharp and constant. The view should have been impressive, a wide valley below and peaks beyond, but the clouds were still low, and everything was gray and close, like the sky had come down to meet the ground. Emma was about 10 feet ahead of me when the ground gave way. It happened fast. 1 second she was stepping onto a section of trail that looked solid, packed earth and gravel, the same surface we'd been walking on for an hour. The next second, the earth under her left foot crumbled and she dropped, her body tilting toward the edge of the ridge where the ground fell away into a steep, rock-strewn slope. She grabbed for a root and missed, and her pack shifted and pulled her sideways, and I felt something open in my chest that I hadn't felt in 3 years, a fear for someone other than myself. I don't remember deciding to move. My body just went. I lunged forward and grabbed her arm, my fingers closing around her wrist, and I dug my boots into the mud and leaned back. For 3 or 4 seconds, neither of us was sure the ground under me would hold both our weight. I could feel the mud shifting under my heels, the slow, sickening slide of earth that wasn't sure it wanted to carry us, and her weight pulling against my grip, and the wind pushing at both of us like it wanted to help the ground decide. She was looking up at me, and I was looking down at her, and in that moment everything else fell away. The storm, the tent, the trail, the 3 years of quiet, all of it collapsed into a single point of focus. I was not going to let go. The ground held. I pulled her up, slowly, my arms shaking with the effort, and we both ended up on our knees in the mud, breathing hard. My heart was hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the cold or the exertion. It was a different kind of hammering, the kind that comes from realizing you almost lost something you didn't know you had started to care about. She was shaken. I could see it in the way she held herself, the slight tremor in her hands, the breath that came too fast. She tried to hide it, the way I try to hide things, by straightening up and brushing off her knees and saying she was fine. But I'd seen it, and she knew I'd seen it, and neither of us said anything about it. I didn't let go of her arm right away. I kept my hand there, on her wrist, and she didn't pull away. We stood there in the wind on the ridge, 2 people in the mud, and the silence between us was full instead of empty for the first time since I'd met her. "You okay?" I said. She nodded. Then she said, "That was closer than I'd like." We found the lower campsite before dark, a flat spot in a grove of old firs, protected from the wind, with a stream nearby. We set up the tent together, moving around each other with an ease that hadn't been there yesterday. She held the poles while I staked the corners, and she threaded the fly while I tightened the guy lines, and it took half the time it should have. When we crawled inside and zipped the door, the tent felt less like hers and more like ours. That night was different from the first. The storm was fading, the rain reduced to a soft tapping on the fly, and the wind had dropped to a murmur that moved through the trees like something remembering what it used to be. The tent was quiet enough to hear the stream outside, a low, steady sound that was almost peaceful. We lay on our pads, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence without touching her. The stove was off, and the tent was dark except for the faint glow of the sky through the nylon. Neither of us had spoken since we'd crawled inside, and the silence wasn't awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who had stopped pretending they were strangers. I spoke first. I didn't plan what I was going to say, which isn't like me. I plan everything. I plan my hikes, I plan my builds, I plan my weeks down to the hour, because planning is how I keep the world from catching me off guard. But the words came the way the words had come on the first night, pulled out of me by something I couldn't name. "I've spent 3 years making sure no one gets close enough to matter," I said. "And the last 2 days are the first time that has felt like a mistake instead of a strategy." I said it plainly, without dressing it up or building to it. I just said it, and let it sit in the dark between us. Emma was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, and I waited. Then she said, "I didn't come to the mountain looking for anything. I came because I was tired of looking." She paused, and I could feel her turn her head toward me in the dark. "But I'm glad the storm found you." I turned my head toward her. I couldn't see her face, just the shape of her on the other pad, the faint light on her hair. "You told me you don't make promises you can't keep," I said. Do you regret it? Any of this? No, she said. I told you, I don't regret it. And I understood then that the promise had never been about the tent. It had been about something bigger, something I'd been too scared to name. It was the promise that letting someone in was worth the risk, that being known was worth the cost of possibly losing again. She'd made that promise the moment she opened the door, and she'd kept it every hour since, with the tea and the dry shirt and the steady voice and the hand she was about to reach out with. She reached over in the dark and took my hand. Not a dramatic gesture, not a movie moment, just her fingers finding mine in the space between our pads. Her hand was warm and steady, the same steadiness I'd noticed from the first moment I saw her in the rain. And I held it, and the feeling that came with it was so simple and so large that I couldn't speak for a second. We lay there like that, holding hands in the dark, while the last of the rain tapped the tent and the stream ran below us. I thought about all the nights I'd spent alone in my house, lying in the dark, listening to nothing. This was the opposite of that. This was lying in the dark and listening to someone breathe, feeling her hand in mine, and knowing that the silence I'd been hiding in was never peace. It was just empty. What happens when we get off the mountain? I asked. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I don't know, and I think that's okay. I fell asleep holding her hand, and for the first time in 3 years, I slept the way I used to sleep when Anna was alive, deep and full, and without fear of what the morning would bring. I woke up to light, not the gray, flat light of the last 2 days, but real light, golden and warm, pouring through the tent walls like the world had finally decided to show up. I unzipped the door, and the air that came in was clean and cold and sharp, the kind of air that only exists after a storm has scrubbed everything clean and started over. The sky was blue, not partly cloudy, not mostly clear, but the deep, full blue that you get in the mountains in late October when the weather breaks and the world remakes itself. The trees were still dripping, and the stream was running high, but everything else was still and bright and new. She was already up, kneeling by the stream, filling her water bottle. She looked up when she heard me and smiled, the same one from the first night, the kind that starts slow and reaches the eyes. Good morning, she said. You slept hard. I did, I said, and I meant it in more ways than one. We packed up in a rhythm that already felt familiar. She rolled the sleeping pads while I took down the tent, and I folded the poles while she stuffed the fly. We moved around each other the way 2 people move when they've learned each other's patterns, and neither of us rushed because neither of us wanted the morning to end. The hike down was quiet, but not heavy. We talked about the trail, about how good a hot meal would feel, about her truck being at a different trailhead than my car. The ordinary future things that people talk about when they're walking toward the world again and want to know if it will still fit. At the trailhead, the gravel lot was empty except for 2 vehicles. Her truck was dusty and old, with a dent in the tailgate and trail stickers on the back window. My car was the one I'd driven up alone 2 days ago, still parked where I'd left it, looking the same as always. We stood between the 2 vehicles, our packs on the ground, and the moment had the weight of something ending and something beginning at the same time. Emma pulled a trail map from her pocket, turned it over, and wrote something on the back. She handed it to me. No pressure, she said, but if you want to hike again sometime, I know a trail that's easier than this one. I looked at the back of the map, her phone number in neat, small handwriting, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who keeps a journal. I folded the map carefully, the way you fold something you want to keep, and put it in my chest pocket. I'll call, I said, and I meant it in a way that surprised me, because 3 years ago I'd stopped meaning things about the future. She got in her truck. I got in my car. I watched her pull out of the lot in my mirror, the dusty truck growing smaller until the road curved and she was gone. I sat in the driver's seat for a long minute. The car was quiet. My house would be quiet. But for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like the only option. I started the car and pulled out of the lot. The map was in my pocket, her handwriting on the back, and the road home looked different. It wasn't shorter or easier, just open in a way it hadn't been before. If this story warmed something in you, leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you the most, because I have a feeling this isn't the last story I'll tell.